Episode 118, 4 Bad Reasons to be a YEC. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I will address statements made in an episode promoting Young Earth Creationism. See link 1. The podcast is Macrophage Strategy, and the host, Ben, did appear on Still Unbelievable in conversation with Andrew and myself in episode 86. See link 2. Ben does make reference to some specific scientific ideas in the episode I reference, and in each case there will be links in the show notes, so please do make use of them when doing your own checking. The bottom line is this: Ben's points are understandable but fatally flawed, and display how fundamentalist mindsets harm our ability to think critically. Young Earth Creationism makes terrible assumptions about our world, and this is why the 4 reasons Ben presents are very bad reasons to be a YEC. I'll start with Ben's introductory preamble, because that helps to set the scene for this episode.
Young Earth Creationism is simply the view that Genesis, the book in the Bible, is an accurate, credible historical record of the history of the world. And from the genealogies in Genesis, we can calculate that the Earth is about 6,000 years old, or a little bit over that at this point in history.
This is basic, but accurate. I take no issue with this as a definition, so for the purpose of this episode, this is what I'll be assuming is meant every time that Young Earth Creationism is referenced.
Now, obviously, this conflicts with what science has found, that the age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, that life on Earth has existed for about 3.5 billion years, and the universe itself is around 13.8 billion years old.
Yes, this is a conflict, and it comes up later in the episode, so we'll get to specific sources then.
So it looks like, at least on the surface, there's a conflict between what Genesis teaches and what science has discovered about our world.
And for me personally, this conflict and investigating the details behind this conflict was the first step in me leaving Christianity.
So I'll give you the 4 reasons right off the bat so you know what they are and can follow the discussion, or rather the monologue. But these are 4 what you might call meta reasons, because they don't require you to have any particular knowledge about biblical hermeneutics or about science. It's just logical reasons to expect that Young Earth Creationism is a better solution to the apparent conflict here.
Notice that straight off Ben is appealing to logical reasons. He hasn't yet brought up science or the scientific methodology or how science knows the things that it does. Straight away he's appealing to logical reasons, which means we're going to have a hint of philosophy going on here.
Then all the other views, just by looking at the nature of science, the nature of biblical hermeneutics, and the tools that we use to solve problems in those disciplines. The first reason has to do with the object of study, which is a historical event, namely the origin of life, the universe, and everything.
Blink and you'll miss it, but notice how the beginning of the universe is referred to as an historical event. We'll come back to that, but hold that thought.
The second reason has to do with the way we get data about the object of study. And the third and fourth reasons have to do with hermeneutics and science as disciplines. So here it is. Reason number 1, history takes precedence over science when the subject of study is a historical event.
This is straight out dishonest bullshit. Ben is trying to deny scientific inquiry to past events that are labelled as history. And who gets to call it history? Oh, he does. What's worse is that there's an unstated assumption that calling something history means that it is literally true. It is an actual event that really happened, but science is not allowed to test the components of this event because they're historic and can't be questioned. Every single cold case detective that ever existed must be shuddering in fear. Not to mention all those esteemed archaeologists. Why should they waste their time digging up artefacts and testing them, when they could just read an ancient document and call it history? Case closed.
If you have a credible, accurate history of an event, you must take that into account as an observation.
Sure, but when your source is an ancient text whose origins are only partially known, how do you determine if it is credible and accurate? Sounds like something that science could help with.
Even if you reject the credibility of that historical account, you have to first argue that the account is not credible, and that takes place in the field of history.
See the links at 3 for a reference to the historical account of Archimedes at the siege of Syracuse. Read about it and ask yourself if you consider the accounts to be credible and accurate. Is there something that science can tell us about the abilities of the equipment allegedly used by Archimedes? I suggest that yes, science can investigate the claims and attempt to build replicas to see if these amazing feats are actually possible. Saying that this is an historical account and that doing this tells us nothing is, well, preposterous.
So let's give an example.
Yes, examples are always very good.
Suppose scientists observe...
Hang on, wasn't this about credible and accurate historical documents where science doesn't get a say in? And yet he's talking about science already. Anyway, let's let him carry on. Suppose scientists observe
human beings dying over and over and over again. And every single time they observe when a human being dies, they do not come back to life. They remain dead. This is observed in a laboratory many times. It's a reproducible observation. And so the scientists then argue that it must be the case that all humans, when they die, always remain dead. No human has ever been observed to come back to life, scientifically, reproducibly in a lab, and therefore human beings do not come back to life once they are dead.
This is what science observes, and this is a very reasonable conclusion from all of the scientific data that we have regarding human death.
Now you might say, well, wait a minute. There's a historical example of at least one person, a human, who did die and came back to life. He was observed to have done so.
There are certainly accounts of people coming back to life in ancient documents. But what makes them credible and reliable historical accounts that Ben would accept? Let's cut to the chase. He's going to reference the resurrection of Jesus and ignore the non-biblical ones that he would reject. This double standard of taking the Bible far too seriously while disregarding other equivalent ancient documents is going to become very apparent.
But the scientists respond, no, that can't be true, because we've done all these experiments that show human beings never come back to life once they're dead.
And that would be a very reasonable conclusion to come to.
But then you say, well, wait a minute. I'm not saying that your observations are wrong or that you're lying to me.
Good, because that would be a problem.
I'm just saying that there is one example in history
Oh, really?
where a human being has been observed to have died and come back to life.
Just one example. In the entirety of history, outside of controlled conditions. So it really must be true.
That is the exception to the rule. That is now a historical claim. Why? Because it's not reproducible.
It's an historical claim due to the fact that it allegedly happened a long time ago. And yes, the exact event is not reproducible. But then no event is ever reproducible. But the circumstances are, and that's what science does, controls for circumstances. Labelling it not reproducible because it's an historical event does not mean it can't be examined. The details certainly can be. And it certainly doesn't magically elevate the description of what happened to the status of credible and accurate.
You can't go back in time 2,000 years ago and observe this as it occurred, and you cannot reproduce it in a lab.
Nobody disputes that. It's not a point worth arguing over.
That now comes out of the realm of science and into the realm of history.
Not strictly true, for the reasons just mentioned.
It does not make it automatically a false claim.
So what? Just believe it because it's an ancient historical claim that can't be examined by science? Really? Is that the road you want to go down? Is that the kind of intellectual integrity that you want to fly from your flagpole? Really? That's where you want to go with this?
It just means you have to evaluate it as a historical claim via the methodology of history as a discipline.
There are several important points to bring up here regarding the process of historical analysis. The first is that modern historians tend to be trusted as individuals keen to separate fact from fiction in ancient records. They are generally a trusted group. Ancient documents are not written to modern historical standards. Historians know this. It should not need pointing out that people lie, especially when recounting events that are important to them, because they typically have a version of the story that they wish to tell. This is true of ancient documents, and historians know this. Historians will also tell us that when writing biographical narratives, ancient writers are known to insert amazing feats designed to elevate the status of the individual concerned. For a modern equivalent, one only needs to look at the feats ascribed to the North Korean Kim dynasty. See link 4 for a small selection of examples.
So let's say you do that evaluation. You evaluate the records of this man's death.
Records written by unknown ancient writers with a story to tell, an agenda to follow, who are not abiding by modern historical standards.
And his resurrection. And you say, look, I find this historical claim of a death and resurrection credible.
Why? Just because you read it? Verisimilitude is not an appropriate standard here.
And therefore the scientific argument...
Argument? Do you mean evidence?
Based on modern observations that are reproducible in a controlled environment cannot be extrapolated into this historical event.
Actually, that's exactly what science does. Go and ask any crime scene investigator.
Because this historical event is a one-time contingent event, it's not reproducible, not observable.
Being one-off is neither the point nor the problem.
But it's a credible historical claim.
Based on what criteria? That's what we're missing here. Tell us, Ben, what's the criteria?
Because the records we have of it are credible.
How do you know?
The sources and primary sources, secondary sources are credible.
Based on what?
The means of transmission to us through those records is credible.
The Gospel accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection have internal contradictions, show evidence of progressing fictional additions, were written down many decades later, have been translated multiple times. None of this justifies calling the accounts credible. And this is the base problem with Christians like Ben. They assume the Bible, or the Gospel accounts in this instance, are unique among all other equivalent ancient documents, in that they are entirely accurate and that the authors bucked the literary trends of the era by never inserting anything fictional that embellished their agenda. This is an insane mindset to take, but it is how you must think if you are going to make the statement that asserts the credibility of the Gospel accounts that reference the death and resurrection of Jesus.
The stories are consistent, etc., etc., etc.
See link 5 for a list of contradictions in the resurrection narrative.
There are many different ways to evaluate a historical claim.
And two of those options are accept it unquestionably, or take a skeptical view and see what you can actually critically analyse and maybe scientifically demonstrate is likely to be true.
My only point here is that historical claims are not automatically invalidated by scientific arguments.
Notice the reference to scientific arguments instead of scientific evidence. Also note the phrase historical claims. He's trying to steer the listener away from the fact that these are ancient narratives written by people who did not take the same attitude to accuracy that modern historians do. When Ben says historical here, he means something old. He doesn't mean something that meets the standards of today's historian research. This is a point that I suspect will be repeated. That said, Ben is technically right. An ancient text containing something seemingly impossible, like a resurrection, is not automatically proven wrong because a science lab failed to replicate it. However, that also does not mean you should default to thinking it is true. There are many reasons why a science lab might fail to validate an ancient claim. But if that claim is something as amazing as a resurrection, the skeptical and honest path to take is that of doubt. Since a resurrection event would be exceptionally rare, it is perfectly acceptable to take the position that it did not happen, and that until further evidence comes to light that indicates it might be possible. Religious arguments do not automatically validate miracle claims in ancient documents of dubious validity.
In fact, historical claims outrank scientific arguments.
When your claims can't be validated using science, delegitimizing the scientific method can be very effective at spreading discord and indoctrinating children.
When the object of study is a historical event.
Historical as in happened a long time ago. Ben is trying to equivocate between historical and actually happened. They're not the same thing, and this intentional confusion is really problematic.
Now it seems to me pretty obvious that the origin of life, the universe, and everything is such an event.
And we flipped from the resurrection back to the start of the universe. Very smoothly done. And it helps to embed the idea of a supernatural agent in the mind of someone who isn't skilled at critical thinking. Sure, this might be events that happened in the past. But unlike the resurrection narratives, it is impossible to claim that there were people around to witness it. So any ancient documents that writes about it is simply doing so on the basis of ancient understanding. Ben has skillfully flipped from the Jesus resurrection and the suggestion that it's written as reliable historical narrative to using the same language about the start of the universe and the first moment of biological life. This is standard apologist tactics and should come as no surprise that it's a trick pulled here. Don't be fooled. A change of subject of this magnitude requires a change of evidential language, but Ben is trying to apply his line that science can't examine the resurrection onto the beginning of everything in an effect to prop up his religious claims. It's bogus, and the only correct response here is laughter. Don't take people seriously when they try to pull this trick.
It is a non-reproducible, non-observable, contingent event.
But elements of it can be broken down into small pieces and each one examined scientifically.
And therefore, history takes precedence when investigating such an event.
What history, though? Who was around to observe it? Who was around to record it? Who could possibly have written it down? Who actually knew what was going on better than today's scientists? This is the problem here.
Young Earth Creationists say we have a historical record that is credible and accurate that describes this event.
Yes, they might say it, but they're fucking wrong.
It's not even in principle amenable to scientific testing.
Quick, someone tell the people at the Large Hadron Collider that everything that they're doing is worthless, especially those there who are Christians.
And that means that scientific evidence can only be tangential. It can't directly test or directly confirm historical theories about origins.
And yet, everything that we do know about the beginning of the universe, if such a phrase is valid, is known through scientific methodologies.
And even if you can test tangential claims, historical claims scientifically, that kind of testing has less authority than the actual historical records detailing the events themselves.
Again, with conflating historical with truthful and accurate. No ancient narrative describing the beginning of the universe can be considered truthful because it was ancient people trying their best to describe something they knew nothing about. Modern scientific endeavour has given us a better knowledge base on which to create and reject ideas. As stated earlier, this is Ben applying unjustified authority to the opening chapters of Genesis.
The best way of exploring the origins question is through history.
Whose version of history? The Aborigines' Dreamtime version of history? That's probably older than the Genesis narrative.
History has a specific methodology for evaluating those kinds of claims.
Ancient writers did not write historical documents to the same standard as modern historians. Again, with the truthful conflation. It's bullshit.
Scientific claims about historical events are not within the core competency of science.
And yet, the things that we are most certain of from the past are given confidence specifically because of the scientific method.
Because science generally deals with repeatable, reproducible, observable events.
And past events can be broken down into constituent parts and examined scientifically and repeatably to determine whether they can actually happen the way described.
That you can test over and over again and make sure that it's correct.
And that's how we can be confident that people don't walk on water.
You can't do that with non-reproducible, non-observable historical events.
But ancient nomadic writers definitely knew what was going on.
And therefore, the field of study which we should consult first about historical events is history, especially if there's a claim being made that a historical record exists.
I know I'm repeating myself, but how do you know that a historical record has any validity or accuracy at all if you disallow the scientific method from investigating the component parts of it?
Young Earth Creationism is the claim that Genesis is an accurate historical record of the origins of life, the universe, and everything.
Sure, it's a historical claim, but if you disallow science, how can you know that any of it is true?
Virtually all other views of origins rest on a scientific claim about a historical event.
Because the repeatable scientific method works and is an effective way of finding out what is true.
Young Earth Creationism rests on a historical
as in old, not historical as in true.
Claim about a historical event, and therefore you should be a Young Earth Creationist.
Oh boy.
Reason number 2, the means of data transmission. What we're talking about here is no longer the object of study, but the way in which we get information about the object of study. So let's say that you agree with me that we should consult historical records first. And now you're going to say, well, what if we're misinterpreting those historical records? And this is a common argument that's made in the context of origins. What if we're not interpreting Genesis correctly when we interpret it to mean a young Earth scenario?
When you disallow the very methodology that enables you to critically evaluate the claims like the age of the Earth or the age of the universe, how do you know that your preferred interpretation is anywhere near accurate? You've got no standard by which to measure it against.
What if the text means something else?
What if there is no actual meaning to interpret and the text is simply a fictional narrative written for pleasure? Many ancient cultures have historical stories talking about these events. They can't all be literally true.
Okay, that's fine. That's a valid criticism, and let's discuss that. The argument being made here is an argument from human fallibility.
It's not controversial to say that ancient human beings wrote down things that are not true. And it's also not controversial to say that modern humans believe incorrectly some of those things to be true.
As human beings, we might be misinterpreting data that we observe from any source.
If only there was a methodology that we could use to help us validate some of these things. I wonder what we'd call it.
If we might be misinterpreting data from the Bible or any other text, it is also the case that we might be misinterpreting data from nature as well.
Misinterpretation is always possible, but not sure what he means by from nature here.
And if you're going to question a historical record on the basis of scientific data, then what we have to do is compare the two sources of data and the ways in which we interpret data from those two different sources.
Sure. But then the question becomes, what process do you use to separate fact from fiction?
Now, I'm not going to get into specifics here. That's for future podcasts. But right now, all I'm going to say is it's more likely that we are correctly interpreting a text, a written text, than scientific data.
Not if you haven't got a methodology for validating what your interpretation is.
And there's a very good reason for this. It's very simply that language in which a written text is communicated was intended for the purpose of communication.
Huh?
The whole point of language is to communicate meaning between human beings, between minds.
Yeah, sure. That's how we tell stories. But nobody thinks that stories are actually true.
So it is very likely that we'll be able to correctly interpret a text, because that's the purpose of text, is to be interpreted correctly.
And yet, of all the Christians around the planet, not a single one shares exactly the same beliefs with another one. And it becomes especially complex when talking about Genesis. So it seems that he's just shot himself in the foot. Oh dear.
Is the same true of scientific data? Well, that answer is a little more complicated, but in general, I think the answer is it's not as likely as a written text that we interpret scientific data correctly.
And this is why scientific method includes very specific instructions on how to stipulate a scientific experiment and how to replicate it. Replication is important because that confirms and validates interpretation.
In Romans 1:20, Paul argues that men have no excuse for rejecting the existence of God because God has made himself known via creation.
Ugh. This is using the Bible to validate the Bible. But what's worse about weaponizing passages like this is that it's used as a tool to victim blame. The reason why I am not convinced that God exists is because I am closed-minded. It's not because creationists use shoddy methodologies and elevate ancient fictional narratives over meticulous modern science. It's your fault and my fault for rejecting their religious claims. Verses like this are used to flip the tables and blame the skeptic for not believing their shitty claims. It's the ultimate in gaslighting, and Christians are the masters of it.
And this has given rise to something called the two books view or two books argument. If you hear anybody talking about two books,
see the link at 6.
The book of nature and the book of the Bible, and we have to take both into account, they're probably some kind of theistic evolutionist or at least old ager.
Oh, the horror!
That argument is trying to put scientific data on the same level as biblical data and saying we have to take both into account. They both have equal authority. Now, right away, the hairs on the back of your neck should go up because that is the same argument that is made by almost every cult, that there is another source of authority outside of the Bible, outside of God's Word, outside of the testimony of the law and the prophets and the apostles.
This is what I hinted at in my intro. The position that Ben is promoting here is that the Bible is unique, ordained by God and seemingly infallible. Therefore, what it says in Genesis 1 must literally be how the universe began. Nothing in science is allowed to contradict it. The Bible takes precedence. There is no room in Ben's thinking for the Bible being a man-made document, a compilation of many ancient fables, poems and tales. Ben can only think in terms of the Bible being a legitimate, accurate, credible history. Andrew and I failed to get Ben to shift on this position when we hosted him on Still Unbelievable. This rigid mindset, impervious to change, closed to the possibility of being wrong, is what makes creationism so dangerous. It traps believers into a state of disallowing anything they think challenges their beliefs. It is this that is cult-like.
That has equal authority to the law, the prophets, and the apostles. That's a serious concern. So we should take very seriously any claim that some other source of information has equal authority to the Bible. People who make that claim are most likely going to fall into the liberal theology camp.
Oh no!
At which point we really need to start talking about biblical authority, and that's a more common apologetic topic that I'm not going to address here. What I really want to address here is the more conservative Christian who is not going to argue that science has authority over the Bible, but he's going to give a version of the two books argument, which goes like this. If we see scientific evidence that our interpretation of the Bible is wrong, that should cause us to consider whether we have in fact misinterpreted the Bible and potentially move to a different interpretation of it. I've even had people say that this sort of encounter with scientific evidence constitutes an opportunity to re-examine our interpretation of the Bible. I have two responses to that. The first response is simply that we should be, as serious-thinking Christians, always open to the possibility that our interpretation of the Bible is wrong. The Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God.
And Ben knows that because the Bible tells him so.
And we should already be taking our interpretation of it very seriously and thinking very critically about it. It is a big deal if we are wrong about what the Bible says to us.
But if your mindset is that nothing takes authority over and above what the Bible says, then what is there that you can use to validate whether or not your interpretation is correct? Because you already view the Bible as being the highest power.
And we should always be questioning our interpretations as fallible human beings.
And the entirety of the Bible was written by, translated by, retranslated by, edited by, and compiled by fallible human beings.
The simple fact of encountering scientific evidence which appears to contradict our interpretation of the Bible is not a special situation which should cause us to question our interpretation of the Bible any more than we should already be concerned about that issue of human fallibility.
Okay.
The second response is that the objection itself contains a couple of unstated assumptions. The first assumption is that the scientific evidence does actually contradict the traditional Young Earth interpretation of the Bible.
Yes, it does. So maybe what we need is a way of actually objectively testing both. That would be cool.
Sometimes this is not always the case. We'll talk about many examples of that in future podcasts. The second assumption, though, is more basic. This is the assumption that our interpretation of the scientific evidence is correct.
Wouldn't it be great if science, say, for example, had an inbuilt mechanism of replication, objective testing, and peer review? That would be really cool, wouldn't it?
Because if you really believed that the Bible was a superior authority to science...
And why would you believe that if you hadn't already been indoctrinated to believe that?
And you also believed in human fallibility, that entails that we could also be wrong in our interpretation of science and of scientific data. If that is really the case, why shouldn't we also question whether our interpretation of the scientific data is in error if it comes into conflict with our interpretation of the biblical data?
This might seem like a fair and straightforwardly honest question, but it isn't. The framing of the question tries to put the biblical text on an equal footing with the scientific data. This is bogus. Let's take the age of the universe as an example. The scientific data that has resulted in an estimated age for the universe being about 13 billion years is based on a variety of astronomy-related measurements from multiple pieces of apparatus and reviewed and tested and reviewed again by multiple scientists. Its age has undergone significant independent testing. Framing it as an interpretation similar to that of the biblical text is blatantly disingenuous. The biblical age of 6 to 10,000 years is based on listed genealogies, which are already known to have issues. There is very little actual data to validate, and the origins of the listed genealogies cannot be revisited and checked. There really is no comparison between the two methodologies, and Ben should know better.
And that is why I argue that we are more likely to correctly interpret a written linguistic text than we are to interpret scientific observations of nature.
And yet, scientific disagreement over the age of the universe is practically zero, whereas how much disagreement do Christians have over the age of the universe? I think that answers his question.
If that is true, then we should first question our scientific interpretations if they come into conflict with our interpretations of the Bible.
No point me wasting your time by repeating my last comment.
It should be an opportunity for reinterpreting the data we get from nature. First and foremost, not an opportunity for reinterpreting data from the Bible.
That's right. Whatever you think the Bible says, that must be the right conclusion, and anything else that comes into conflict with that is clearly wrong and needs to be reinterpreted. But whatever you do, don't ever challenge your interpretation of the Bible, because that's the right one.
The primary purpose of nature is not the same as the primary purpose of language, which is to communicate meaning.
Oh, so they're not equivalent after all. Okay.
Nature does communicate meaning. It does communicate some things to us. But the primary purpose of nature is not to do that. It's not about communication. The primary purpose of nature is to create an environment where conscious life other than God can exist. It has been, is now, and will continue to perform this purpose just fine without our fully understanding how it works. And we don't have to understand how nature works in order for it to do its primary job. By contrast, language is failing in its primary purpose if it fails to communicate to us accurate information. If nature communicates to us God's existence, His invisible qualities and divine nature, then we should accept that on the basis of Romans 1:20.
Bizarre terminology aside, what the fuck does it mean to say that nature communicates God to us? Good God. It's almost as though he's intentionally obfuscating what he's actually trying to say. Lord of confusion, anyone?
But we are given no guarantee, either from the Bible or anywhere else, including philosophy of science, that we will always correctly interpret data from nature.
I don't think there's anyone who actually disagrees with that last point. If only science had some kind of methodology where we would repeatedly test things to validate the conclusions we come to.
We can always be wrong about that. And in fact, we have been wrong about that many, many times in the past.
And do you know what the absolute kicker is? The process by which we determine whether or not we've come to wrong conclusions about science is using the very same scientific method. Wow! Amazing!
So that is reason number 2, to be a young earth creationist as your default position. It is far more likely that we're able to correctly interpret a text like Genesis than to correctly interpret nature.
If you start from the position that the Bible is infallible, well then you're going to come to the conclusion that the Bible is infallible because everything else fails next to it. Not really a surprise.
Young Earth Creationism is the claim that traditionally Christians have correctly interpreted the book of Genesis and the Bible as a whole about the history of the world. Therefore, it's our scientific interpretation that needs to be questioned, if it conflicts with our biblical interpretation.
When you refuse to let new data challenge your previously existing assumptions about the accuracy of the Bible, then you're never going to give yourself the opportunity of finding out whether or not you're wrong.
I find the young earth position to be more likely to be the case based simply on the nature of written texts versus science.
No point me wasting your time by repeating my last comment, so I'll say this instead. The fact that there are people today who would take an ancient text written by people with no concept of modern scientific method as superior to the results of the latest scientific research is utterly insane. And yes, Andrew and I were once one of those people. You'll hear our story told in the latest series that we've kicked off.
Reason number 3, hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a fancy word that just means our method of interpreting a text, in this case the Bible.
The links at 7 will take you to some resources on hermeneutics. As Ben said, it is essentially about interpretation of texts. How do you get to what the original author intended from the text? Now let's grant to Ben that he has correctly interpreted Genesis to be written as the literal account of what actually happened, and that the authors intended it to be interpreted as inspired by God. I am prepared to grant that, despite young earth creationism being a minority view within Christianity. The reason I'm prepared to grant that is that original author intent is not equivalent to real-world truth. Just because the unknown author who originated the creation narrative might have intended it to be literal, does in no way mean that there is actually any truth in what the passage says. This is something that Ben has consistently failed to acknowledge in this episode so far, and he failed to grasp it when Andrew and I had our chat with him.
One of the main principles of hermeneutics is that you cannot bring information from outside the text into your interpretation of the text.
See the link at 8, where a paragraph reads as follows. One of the central tenets of hermeneutics is that texts cannot be divorced from their context or the intentions of their authors. This principle challenges us to look beyond the surface and consider the broader circumstances in which a text was created. This is not the same as what Ben has just stated, and the difference is, in my view, important. I think Ben uses what he has just said as an excuse to ignore modern understandings of context. But I would say that it is important not to ignore that. For example, we know that at the time the Gospels were written, it was common for biographical writers to inject fictionalizations into a narrative. If you ignore that context, you risk taking the resurrection of Jesus more seriously than you should. The resurrection narrative is very probably fiction.
Especially when you have reason to believe that the author of the text never had access to that information and didn't know it.
And yet, modern knowledge can go an awful long way to helping us and informing us of how an original text was created, was written, and the mindsets of the time that inspired it.
This is the case in spades when we're talking about the author of Genesis and modern scientific information.
Refusing to acknowledge updated information is far more likely to mean your interpretation is more wrong than others.
Our modern scientific ideas of how old the Earth is did not exist until roughly the 1700s or later.
That's what progress is. Modern ideas, better information replaces old, incorrect information, which means ancient people who wrote about the origins of the universe without modern scientific information are more likely to be wrong. Fuck's sake.
Moses, or whoever you think wrote the book of Genesis, did not have access to that information.
Therefore, he's probably wrong.
And therefore, they could not have meant anything of the kind when they wrote the book of Genesis.
Which means they can't possibly have got the right answer.
Any method of hermeneutics which introduces information into your interpretation of a text that comes from outside the text, and especially outside the cultural context of when the text was written, is improper hermeneutics. It's usually called eisegesis.
See link 9.
This is a well-known feature of biblical hermeneutics, and it is not just a feature of the origins debate. Pretty much every other view that tries to reconcile the modern scientific consensus on the age of the earth and many other issues with the text of Genesis inevitably falls prey to this problem. Inevitably, all other views are attempting to reinterpret what the Genesis text means in light of modern science.
Sure, and that probably means that those people are getting to the wrong original interpretation of the Genesis texts. Ben probably does have the right interpretation of those Genesis texts. But it doesn't mean that what it says is literally true.
That is eisegesis, and it is improper hermeneutics. The person who wrote the text and the people to whom it was written could not have understood the text to mean something that they had no knowledge of.
But a God could have, if, as many Christians will assert, it was God who actually inspired and dictated the words that are written.
Therefore, whatever we think is the truth today, whatever we try to reinterpret the text as meaning, it could not have actually meant that when it was written. For a number of reasons, that is bad hermeneutics, and it is likely misinterpreting what God intended to communicate through the text.
Surely you have to know what God actually intended to be able to make such a comment.
Notice that what the text means is prior to any decision about whether the text is correct or incorrect.
Oh my God! Did he just begrudgingly admit interpretation is not truth? Did that sound like it was through gritted teeth to you? If Ben is serious about this point, it means he needs to look at a method of validating what the Bible says, other than the Bible itself. Is he at risk at shitting all over his earlier suggestion that science can't trump the Bible?
You have to know what a text means before you decide whether it's true or false.
Well, of course.
So you could come to the conclusion that the modern scientific consensus is correct and the Earth is billions of years old and the universe and everything else is billions of years old, but you would then have to conclude that Genesis is wrong about the age of the Earth. That is a position that's available to you, but the position that is not available to you because of the nature of hermeneutics, properly done, is to claim that the text of Genesis actually means something that we only understood it to mean within the last couple hundred years. The authors themselves, the original audience, didn't understand it that way.
The links at 10 go to articles on Genesis 1. Christians vary widely on how to take that first chapter. It is not as simple as Ben is making out. One point that needs to be made in response to what Ben has just said is that if you can't know who the author was, then you can't know what they meant. Ben is very confident that the author meant a literal 6-day creation, but that confidence has almost no foundation. The author is unknown, and the time period it was written is also in dispute by some. And that's before you get to the style of writing and how it differs from later chapters. Without this key information, any claim that Genesis 1 was intended to be taken literally is suspect, especially when key indicators, like the writing style, suggest something else.
But now we suddenly know, because of modern science, what an ancient text actually means. That is not proper hermeneutics, and that option is not available.
I'm not aware that anyone says we know what it means because of modern science. This just stinks of mudslinging to me. It's not really a serious objection.
Because many people have decided a priori that modern science cannot be wrong.
Huh? Where on earth does he get that idea from?
They have taken that option anyway, even though it's clearly improper hermeneutics. And so this argument precludes a large number of views on trying to reconcile Genesis with modern science. Meanwhile, it is totally fine to include historical observations of nature in your scientific explanations. In fact, it could be argued that all observations of nature are historical. It doesn't matter whether an observation was made yesterday, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or even 6,000 years ago. As long as it's an observation of nature, it can be included as scientific data and used in a scientific theory or explanation.
Oh, scientific data can now be used when examining an ancient document, so long as you don't gather the scientific data in the future. Right. Okay then. So
there is nothing wrong with using historical data in a scientific theory. There is, however, something very wrong with using scientific data or scientific theories in the interpretation of a historical or ancient text.
But what if that historic or ancient text makes claims which can be tested or investigated by science? Like, say, I don't know, the creation of the Earth, universe and everything?
Therefore, by the very nature of the methodologies of proper hermeneutics and proper science, Young Earth Creationism is the best position.
Well, it's certainly the simplest and possibly most honest interpretation of that first chapter of Genesis. But I would not go any further than that. It's frankly bluntly wrong, but that does appear to be what Genesis 1 says.
Young Earth Creationism says that the Bible is history, and we are allowed to use historical observations in a scientific explanation. All other views on origins, in one way or another, attempt to do the opposite. They attempt to reinterpret the Bible using information from outside not only the text itself, but the entire historical and cultural context of when the text was written.
That assumes you know when the text was written and therefore what its cultural context is. But let's not forget that it is actually Christians who are reinterpreting Genesis 1 in the light of modern science, because they need it to still look like it is a God-inspired holy book. Ben's argument isn't really against atheists like me who don't take Genesis seriously. It's against Christians who tried to make Genesis 1 look serious in light of modern science. And since we know the Earth is older than 10,000 years, those Christians need to use an interpretation other than the one Ben wants them to use.
That is improper hermeneutics. Young Earth Creationism fits both the proper rules of hermeneutics and the proper rules of science. And that is reason number 3 why you should be a Young Earth Creationist. Now you might say, Ben, Or if you didn't know my name was Ben, you would say macrophage. What if I just don't think that there's good evidence either way, and I want to withhold my opinion and say, I don't know. I want to be agnostic on this issue. Maybe in the future we'll figure it out. I'm sure we'll figure it out in heaven. It's just not an important issue for me. Let's just be agnostic and not claim that we know what's going on here. Okay, well, here's reason number 4, especially for you, why you should be a Young Earth Creationist. And it has to do with the way science works. If we expect there to be a resolution to the apparent conflict between what Genesis teaches about the age of the earth, or what it appears to teach about the age of the earth, and what modern scientific arguments appear to claim about the age of the earth, then it is most likely that that resolution will come with increased scientific knowledge rather than increased knowledge about what Genesis means. Why? Because science is constantly changing and biblical hermeneutics is not.
Oh boy, it's weird to hear this point because it is one that kept me tied to my biblical literalism for way too long. Science is supposed to change. Science is a methodology by which we gather and learn new information with every single experiment we do. Science has never known everything there is to know, and that is why, when we learn enough new information about something, we get the opportunity to change our explanations about things. It is this progression that gives us more fuel-efficient cars, better battery technology, faster wireless internet, and many, many more things that we benefit from every year. This is how the theory of gravity became relativity. This is how continental drift became plate tectonics. Science changing is science progressing. To suggest that it's anything other than a good thing is to be too religiously blinkered to put the effort into understanding why we know what we know. It's the things that don't change that need closer examination.
The friend I spoke about in the introductory sort of trailer episode, who was or is a top immunology researcher, told me once that he reads 150 scientific papers a week. These are studies that usually report novel research, new observations about nature, essentially. And that is not surprising if you understand the amount of scientific work that is taking place. It is fairly routine to come across new information that causes you to question what you previously thought you understood about nature.
When we study areas that are at the edge of our knowledge, then it will be routine to make new discoveries. This is the point after all. Sometimes this will enhance what we know. Sometimes it will change what we know. This is a good thing. We're learning new stuff. This is why the ancient idea that the earth was created in 6 days should have died by now. But it is being kept alive purely due to Christians who refuse to adopt this new information.
That's part of the excitement of science and the interest that it draws for people as a career. Science is always changing, and we have good reason to expect that it will continue to change in the future, and not just change, but radically change.
Why do I get the impression that he doesn't think this is a good thing?
The history of science shows many paradigm shifts in how we understand nature. These are radical changes or shifts in our understanding of what we thought we previously knew, usually because of new data that's often observed because of increases or advances in technology. In fact, the very term paradigm shift was coined by a philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn when he was trying to describe these shifts in scientific understanding. Furthermore, there are very good reasons to suspect that our current scientific understanding is faulty in certain areas.
And there it is. Science changes. Therefore, what we think we know now could all be wrong. Yeah, he doesn't really understand science, does he?
Especially in physics.
Well, maybe quantum physics, but regular physics is pretty well tied down. We've got a good understanding of a lot of stuff.
most mainstream physicists themselves expect a paradigm shift to occur in the future for this same reason.
In quantum physics, maybe. But what would that look like? It wouldn't magically invalidate the things that we've already shown to be correct. The worst that would happen is that in some areas of active study, new paths of investigation will be opened. In science, being wrong is always an option. It means that you now have a whole new area of study to investigate. Ben's concern here is very vague when he really should be specific about what he thinks could change and what the implications of that would be. This comes across as him just trying to drop a bomb of confusion for any of his fellow creationists who lack the desire to actually take the time to read what scientists are saying.
The very basic reason is that our two best physical theories, quantum mechanics, or the standard model of particle physics, and general relativity, are deeply incompatible with each other.
See the links at 11 for further reading on the issues between the standard model of physics and general relativity. This is not new. It means that there is something we don't know. It means we have a learning opportunity. The issues between the two theories are well understood, and the reasons why are also known. It's the detail that is currently lacking and being investigated. And yet, despite this missing knowledge, the two theories achieve what they need to in terms of advancing our knowledge. They still help us fly spacecraft across the solar system and smash atoms together at incredible speeds. Despite not having a unified theory, we still manage to make great advances of science and understanding. This missing knowledge isn't bringing down science, and filling that knowledge gap won't bring it down either. Ben's complaint is a religiously motivated excuse to dismiss inconvenient science. It's not actually the big Achilles heel he'd like to make it out to be.
And physicists have been trying for many decades, in fact close to a century at this point, to reconcile these two seemingly incompatible theories. Because they have no choice. These theories are highly accurate. They have both generated the most accurate predictions ever. So we can't just say they're wrong. But the fact that they're incompatible suggests that there's something else going on that we just don't understand about nature.
And because those theories work so well, it's probably not the big thing that Ben's trying to make it out to be.
What is it? What is it that we don't understand?
We'll know that answer when we understand it.
Well, we have some clues. Quantum mechanics is a theory about the nature of matter itself and how subatomic particles behave. Relativity is a theory about how gravity works. But relativity does not contain any account of quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics contains no account of gravity. Which is weird, because we know that gravity has something to do with mass, and quantum mechanics is our best theory of mass, of matter. So why is there no account of gravity in our best theory of mass, if gravity is due to mass somehow?
And what the fuck has this got to do with validating Young Earth Creationism?
There are other deep incongruities that I'm told exist by physicists that I don't even understand. But suffice to say, string theory is, or maybe it's appropriate now to say was, an attempt to reconcile these two seemingly incompatible theories, and it was pursued for decades by theoretical physicists, in spite of the fact that there were doubts about whether string theory was even scientific or not, or could even generate testable predictions.
If you don't have a go, you'll never know. We didn't discover the Higgs boson until we built a big enough collider to detect it. We didn't detect gravitational waves until we built a second experiment to detect them because the first one wasn't big enough. You need to try.
Today, after the experiments at the Large Hadron Collider, it seems less likely than ever that string theory is correct. The way I understand it, and I'm not a physicist, but the way I understand this is that one of the prerequisites for string theory is a set of theoretical particles called supersymmetric particles. They're theorized to be analogous to the known particles from the standard model, but sort of like their mirror image, like a pair. So each supersymmetric particle is paired with a known particle from the standard model. And this is almost a prerequisite for most versions of string theory. The only problem is the experiments at the Large Hadron Collider in the previous decade failed to find any evidence of supersymmetric particles. This means that most versions of string theory that had been pursued by theoretical physicists are now off the table.
That's what happens when you get to this level of scientific endeavour. You have multiple ideas, you build a honking great experiment, you test out the ideas, and you see which ones have validity and which ones don't. This is not a bad thing. This is science in action.
There are still some string theorists out there pursuing this idea, but all the buzz that I've heard is in the realm of quantum gravity, which are different kinds of theories that are attempting to derive gravity from quantum mechanics itself. But all of this remains highly speculative.
Cutting-edge science always will be.
There is no consensus about it except that the problem remains unresolved for the most part. Physics has a physics problem. Physics has not figured out a theory of everything, which we should expect exists if nature is unified as a whole. It's under the same set of rules everywhere at all times, as we would expect if we believe the universe is created. There is a consistent set of rules that have to be unified, and they have to be rational if the universe was created by God, who has a rational mind.
Surely he can't be suggesting that because we don't understand the universe, God can't exist? No, he can't mean that. Can he?
They have to be intelligible to rational minds. Now, I find it interesting that the biggest problems in theoretical physics also seem to correlate to the biggest problems in creation science, namely radiometric dating, which has to do with the behavior of subatomic particles. Quantum mechanics describes the behavior of subatomic particles. Likewise, general relativity, and especially special relativity, are theories about vast cosmic distances, massive gravitational forces, and the speed of light, and how gravitational forces affect light. The second biggest problem with creation science is the light time travel problem. How do we see light from stars that are billions of light years away in only 6,000 years, if the universe is indeed only 6,000 years old?
Well, that's easy. It's not 6,000 years old. Come on, dude. Wake up. You just gave yourself the answer.
Now, do I have an answer for you here? Well, not in this episode. We'll discuss some of this stuff later on. But in general, those are the two biggest scientific problems with creation science. And I find it interesting that they do seem to correspond to the biggest problem in physics right now, which is how to reconcile the theories that we have which describe things like radioactive decay and light from distant stars.
Well, he's stretching it a little bit there. This really does smack of wishful thinking more than anything else.
So science is known to change radically, and often it changes because its source data changes, meaning we accumulate more data that we didn't have before, and suddenly our old theories no longer work to explain the new data.
Emphasis on the new data. The theory of gravity still works perfectly fine. It's simple enough, and we still get spacecraft to the moon through it. It doesn't stop them working at all. It's just a little bit of extra new data that they struggle with a little bit. It doesn't break everything or anything.
So, oftentimes we undergo, in science, a paradigm shift, where you have to radically change your theory to accommodate new physical data.
Gravity still works now that we have relativity. Continents still move now that we have plate tectonics. Things keep working.
Which is being observed all the time. In fact, just recently, the James Webb Telescope just came online, and we're getting data that we've never gotten before about the stars. It happens all the time in science. It's routine.
Yes, we learn new things. That's the wonderful, great thing about science. That's why the James Webb Space Telescope exists, in order for us to learn new things. But I tell you what it won't do. It won't make Young Earth Creationism more true. Because that's a dead idea that died a long time ago. Move on.
Meanwhile, in the field of biblical hermeneutics, there really isn't that much change in the actual data we have about an ancient text like Genesis. Every now and then you uncover some ancient inscriptions or other types of archaeological discoveries that shed new light on an ancient text, like Genesis. So recently in the news, there was an ancient Hebrew inscription that was uncovered from the time when the Pentateuch was written. But all that discovery really did was confirm that the type of Hebrew that the Bible is written in, the type of ancient Hebrew, actually did exist several hundred years prior to any other evidence that we had that it exists. And so it removed some of the questions that some scholars had about whether or not the Pentateuch was actually as old as was claimed to be. So in other words, that discovery just confirmed what traditional conservative biblical scholars already believed.
So nothing that tells you anything about the validity, accuracy, or truthfulness of those texts.
In many cases, the biggest discoveries about the Bible have been very similar. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a perfect example. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and all they really did was confirm that our current version of the Bible is accurate to an earlier date than we previously could prove that it was accurate to.
What the Dead Sea Scrolls also told us was it gave us a map of the changes to some of the texts that make up the Bible. We know that those texts have changed, and the Dead Sea Scrolls helped us to map those changes.
That's all the Dead Sea Scrolls did. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were the biggest archaeological discovery relating to the Bible in modern times.
And it killed the idea that the texts are absolutely reliable in their transmission right up to today. Yet Christians, literalists, fundamentalists, creationists deny that.
It's not like in science when you discover new information like the perihelion of Mercury, or that subatomic particles make quantum leaps and exist in discrete packets of energy, or things like that require a paradigm shift in how we understand science.
Yeah, he's overusing that word now. These things aren't having the groundbreaking effects that he's trying to suggest that they do.
In fact, the traditional interpretation of the book of Genesis is still the viable, best interpretation of the book of Genesis, despite all the discoveries that we've made.
Only when you disallow all of the appropriate evidence. When you're tied to a belief like this, and you deny anything that could contradict it, then of course you're going to sit there confident in your belief.
There has never been an archaeological or textual discovery that has radically altered the situation of biblical interpretation, especially in regards to Genesis, in 2,000 years or more.
And that's why it has never been an accurate description of how the universe came to be.
The source data in biblical hermeneutics is the Bible, and it's not going to change.
And creationists will always be wrong.
The farther removed we are from the actual writing of the Bible and the events described there, the less likely we're going to see change in the future. In biblical hermeneutics, it gets less likely that we will see radical shifts in our understanding of the Bible as time moves on. In science, as time moves on, it becomes more likely we'll see radical shifts in scientific understanding.
And that's a good thing.
So even if you're on the fence on this issue, you should still be a young earth creationist, because odds are, if you don't see a solution right now, it's far more likely that a solution will occur through a radical shift in our understanding of science.
And the radical shift that got us to reject creationism has already happened.
As opposed to a radical shift in our understanding of the Bible. You can look at the Bible as it is, it's our rock, it's not going to change, and interpret it correctly with all the tools we can have now or ever expect to have. And you can say, look, this is what I think the Bible means. This is the best interpretation of the text. And you know what? If it doesn't comport with some scientific arguments today, maybe that'll change in the future.
You can file that one under things that'll never happen. Like, I don't know, creationists actually doing real science to test their ideas?
Indeed, it is almost certain to change in the future. And in philosophy of science, this acceptance of change in theories is so pervasive that it has generated all kinds of doubts about whether scientific understanding is even an accurate representation of reality at all.
Yeah, he's just making shit up now. Are you bored yet?
Because if it's constantly changing and we expect it to change in the future, how confident can we be that our current scientific understanding is actually an accurate representation of reality? Reason number 4 to be a young Earth creationist is that science changes rapidly, dramatically, radically, and the Bible does not.
Forgive me for repeating myself. Science changes because it learns new information with every experiment. And because science doesn't currently know everything there is to know, it is modest enough to adjust and change according to the new information it learns. If you ignore the places where people have edited the biblical text, the reason why the Bible doesn't change is because ignorant religious belief is impervious to learning, because it is arrogant enough to think it knows all it needs to know.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed these 4 reasons to be a young Earth creationist.
And I hope you enjoyed my reasons why you shouldn't. Coming up in future episodes of Still Unbelievable are some interviews and the continuation of our series with David from Skeptics and Seekers on our journeys into and out of Christianity. You can contact us with questions about our experiences at the usual email address. And until next time, stay reasonable. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.